I stated in a previous video that the genealogies in Genesis channel their focus on Abraham as the chief figure to pass on the work of redemption, and that is why the division within the 10 genealogies in Genesis is centered on Abraham. Remember, there are 5 before and 5 after him. The genealogies do not simply list the lineage of a person or family, they establish the structural framework for all of redemptive history. Most of the genealogies in the Bible list the most important figure at the end so that the new era begins with that person. Thus the genealogy in Genesis chapter 11 is recorded with Abraham in mind and hints at the role that he would play in the future. Beginning with Abraham, the mode of the book of Genesis changes. God goes from explaining history thousands of years at a time to focusing on one man. The first 11 chapters of Genesis focus on events. However, beginning with Abraham, the focus is on the people. And in Matthew chapter 1, Jesus Christ was called the Son of Abraham, and we know that this is a fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham that through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. However, in Genesis 11:31, we find that when God called him the first time, Abraham was living in Ur of the Chaldeans. This was an area in ancient Mesopotamia full of polytheism. We know that Terah, Abraham's father, was an idol worshiper. So how then was Abraham capable of making the decision to accept a monotheistic ideology and obey God himself rather than pursuing the life he had always known? To understand this, we have to turn to his predecessors in the line of faith, who are conveniently listed for us in Genesis chapter 11. The beginning of the genealogy in Genesis chapter 11 is Shem, one of the sons of Noah who helped in the building of and the preparing for the ark. He was one of the 8 that survived the judgment when God poured out his wrath on humanity by the flood judgment. In Genesis 9:26, Noah calls God the God of Shem, signifying a passing of the torch to his son. Shem continued that line of faith from Noah his father, and this is why he is listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 3. In this study, then, we will examine what went so terribly wrong to find Abraham just 10 generations later in a place of idol worship, and how through his divine administration God would put everything back on track. When studying the genealogy of Shem, we find that not all the patriarchs listed in the genealogy were godly men. The separation from God seems to begin with the 5th patriarch after Noah, Peleg, the son of Eber. The name Peleg in Hebrew has the meaning of to split or to be divided. The Bible records in Genesis 10:25 that Peleg received his name because it was in his day that the earth was divided. It was around the time of the Tower of Babel construction when mankind attempted to build a tower to reach heaven and defy God that Eber had his son Peleg. We can also assert that Peleg took part in the construction of the tower by observing his lifespan, but for a moment I want to focus on his father Eber. Eber was born 4 generations after Noah, just 3 generations after the Great Flood. The name Eber derives its meaning from the Hebrew word abar, which means to pass over, or region across or beyond. Thus, the name Eber hints of his crossing over the Euphrates River away from the land of Sin in Mesopotamia, where the Tower of Babel would be constructed. Now, the word Hebrew is derived from the same root word of Eber, indicating that Eber is an ancestor of the Hebrew nation. We find something peculiar in the genealogy of the descendants of Noah in Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis 10:21, when God introduces the line of Shem, the record changes its format and adds an introduction to the genealogy. God highlights Eber's significance by praising him, even before listing Shem's descendants, calling Shem the father of the children of Eber. Think about that. Shem's son was Arpachshad, and his grandson was Shelah, but God sets them to the side for a moment to express that Shem's descendants were the children of Eber. As Noah had called God the God of Shem, now God expresses a passing of the torch to Shem's descendant Eber, and in this manner points to Eber as an important link to Abraham. Now, according to clay tablets discovered around the region of what is now Aleppo in Syria, there existed a highly civilized city-state in the region called Ebla. It is believed that Eber was its founding king, and that the city-state had previously existed as a small city, but was established as a large city-state during Eber's time. According to those clay tablets, the kingdom of Ebla flourished in the arts and academic fields, and reached its peak around 2300 BC when Eber ruled. Records of tribute receipts from the nations in the Euphrates region were excavated from that site, giving credence to the theory that the kingdom of Ebla was the most powerful kingdom in the ancient Near East of that time. This also enforces the assertion that due to the meaning of his name, at the time when the Tower of Babel was being construction, and mankind was once again turning away from God, Eber crossed over the river Euphrates away from Mesopotamia, going toward Haran, and erected his city to maintain his orthodox faith in God. His son, however, clearly stayed behind in a sinful and corrupt land full of men who defied God. As I said earlier, we can conjecture that Peleg the son of Eber aided the construction of the Tower of Babel due to his lifespan. Proverbs 10:27 states, "The fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be shortened." The fear of God means to wholeheartedly revere and serve Him and acknowledge that He is the one to be awed. The command to fear God appears many times throughout the Scriptures. Proverbs 1:7 tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Those who fear God will keep away from evil. Therefore, if we want to enjoy longevity, we must immediately do away with sins that are close around us in our lives. Sin shortens our lives and prevents the blessings of heaven from reaching us. Man was originally created for eternal life, but death came by the way of sin. You can find that in Romans 5:12 and 6:23. Although man didn't die right away, their lifespans grew shorter and shorter as they continued to sin despite God's love. Man's lifespan was abruptly shortened once after the flood, and again after they attempted to exalt their own name and challenge God during the construction of the Tower of Babel. God responded by cutting their lifespan in half. Let's take a moment now and examine the longevity of those in the genealogies of Genesis from Adam to Abraham. Now, I'm not going to read each scripture for time reasons, but I will put it in the video so you can look it up by yourself if you want to. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912. Enosh lived 905 years. Kenan lived 910 years. Mahalalel lived 895 years. Jared lived 962 years. Enoch, the man who walked with God, only lived 365 years, but he never saw death. Methuselah lived 969 years. He had the longest longevity. Lamech, the one who lived 56 years contemporaneously with Adam, lived 777 years. And Noah lived 950 years. Noah's son Shem lived 600 years. Now all of these men were born prior to the flood, and their average lifespan comes to around 881 years. Now those born after the flood and prior to the Tower of Babel construction are Arpachshad, Shelah, and Eber. Arpachshad lived 438 years, Shelah lived 433 years, and Eber lived 464 years. Their average lifespan comes to about 445 years. Now, after the construction of Babel event, the lifespans are cut in half again. Peleg lived only 239 years. So did his son Reu. Serug lived 230 years. Nahor lived 148. Terah, the father of Abraham, lived 205 years. And Abraham himself lived 175 years. Now, the lifespan then, after the construction of the Tower of Babel event, it was cut down to 206 years. After Abraham, no one lived past 200 years. Moses said that his eyes did not grow dim until he was 120 years old, but in Psalm 90 verse 10, the Bible records, "As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or if due to strength, 80 years." Shortened lifespans are a sure indication that sin had seeped deeply into the lives of mankind. Let's read Psalm 55 verse 23. "But you, O God, will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed and deceit will not live out half their days, but I will trust in you." Had Peleg followed his father and left Mesopotamia, would he not have enjoyed the longevity similar to his father? The fact that Peleg received his name due to the fact that the earth was divided in his time, and his lifespan is half that of his predecessors, we can assert that he was in fact a sinful man that defied God and met the fate of only living out half of his days. He even died 10 years before Noah. Nahor, Abraham's grandfather, died 9 years before Noah. Abraham left Haran at the age of 75 for the land of Canaan, 367 years after the flood, meaning that Peleg and Nahor were dead at the time, and Reu would die only 3 years later. We studied in the genealogy from Adam to Noah that Adam lived 56 years contemporaneously with Noah's father Lamech, and we explained that this was how Noah was capable of having the faith to build the ark for 70 to 80 years after only being told once by God to do so. Would it surprise you then that there is a similar coincidence in this genealogy? Remember what we said in that study. The blessing of longevity is a gift granted to the descendants of Adam in order to enrich their faith and provide the patriarchs with forefathers who experienced the mercy of God firsthand. One of the reasons that Abraham would have the faith to leave Ur of the Chaldeans and later move on from Haran was that Abraham lived contemporaneously with Noah, the builder of the ark and survivor of the wrathful judgment of God for 58 years. Now let's do some math. Remember that Noah lived for 950 years. Now the Bible doesn't record specifically how old Noah was when Shem was born, but it does provide the information we need to figure it out. We know that Shem was 100 years old when he had his son Arpachshad, and this was 2 years after the flood. So if Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood, then Shem would have been 98 years old the year of the flood. And if Shem was 98 years old the year of the flood, the same year that Noah was 600 years old, then we know that Noah had to have been 502 years old when Shem was born. So if Noah had Shem at 502, and Shem had his son Arpachshad at 100, Arpachshad had his son Shelah at 35, Shelah had his son Eber at 30, Eber had his son Peleg at 34, Peleg had his son Reu at 30, Reu had his son Serug at 32, Serug had his son Nahor at 30, Nahor had his son Terah at 29, and Terah was 70 years old when he gave birth to his son Abraham. And we can add all of those numbers up, then we know that Noah was 892 years old when Abraham was born. This means that Noah lived 58 years contemporaneously with Abraham. Now again, remember, contemporaneously only means that they lived at the same time. You can't prove biblically that they did in fact speak to one another. But you do know that Eber, Abraham's forefather, did erect the city-state Ebla in the same area of Haran, and that Abraham stayed there for several years, leaving at the age of 75. Now after that time, leaving Haran at 75, Abraham would live contemporaneously with Shem, Noah's son, for 100 years. He would live 73 years with Arpachshad, 100 years with Shelah, and 100 years with Eber. Abraham would live the rest of his life contemporaneously with 3 patriarchs born prior to the construction of the Tower of Babel. Eber, the king of Ebla, whose name shares the same root as the word Hebrew, even lived to potentially see the birth of Jacob, Abraham's grandson, dying only 4 years after his birth in 2170 BC. Abraham is also called a Hebrew during his time in Canaan in Genesis 14:13. This reinforces the fact that Abraham and Eber shared characteristics and that his life mirrored that of Eber, for him to be recognized as a Hebrew, a child of Eber. Abraham was truly a great man of faith. In a world of reprobate minds where right was wrong and wrong was right, Abraham clung to God and leaned wholly on him, and for doing so God rewarded him with the blessing that in him all the earth would be blessed. Through Abraham a nation was born, and the seed of the woman came. In the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 1, Jesus is introduced as the son of Abraham. And we read in Galatians 3:29 that if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Belonging to Christ means that you are Abraham's descendant. The focus of our next few studies will be on Abraham and the promises that God made and fulfilled to and through him. Until then, this is Deacon saying thanks for watching. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe so you can keep up to date with my latest videos when they're released. And God bless.